If you love me, you will obey me. I don't know that you probably ever heard of Aunt Annalena Toninelli. She was a Christian aid worker who for 20 years spent her life in Kenya and Somalia setting up and operating a humanitarian aid center for a Christian agency. And in the latter part of the 2000s, she was assassinated by the rebels who object to her working with the poor and dispossessed of Somalia. Just a few weeks before she was assassinated, she had been interviewed by the Washington Post while she was on a furlough back to America. And she was asked by the reporter what motivated her to spend her life and devote it the way she did among some of the poorest and sickest of human beings without giving up as being a hopeless effort. And here's what she said. She said, "I've learned that true inner peace can only come when I learn to spend my life in love. It doesn't matter whether others appreciate what I do. What matters is only that I am a vessel of God's love, that God has privileged and faithfully given me to share. God's call on my life, whether I chose it or not initially, was to go to Kenya and Somalia and help. And for that, it cost her her life. Killed in a senseless kind of a way. She was a woman who truly lived a life of obedient delight. You know, whether we realize it or not, as Christian believers, we are constantly confronted with that choice that's on the screen right now. My way or God's way? Every single moment of the life that you and I live in the next 7 days, we're going to be confronted with that choice. Am I going to, in this particular situation, live my life the way I want it, or am I going to live it the way God wants it? Now, I would dare say that we probably don't often think about that all the time. Is it going to be my way, or is it going to be God's way? In John chapter 14, Jesus simply says, "The sign and proof you love me is that you obey me." But that's so simple, isn't it? The proof and the sign of your devotion and love for me is that you obey my commands or obey my words. And yet obedience is a struggle. As a matter of fact, if you spend much time reading the Old Testament, you discover how hard obedience was for those Israelites. I mean, time after time after time after time, God tells them how He wants them to live their life, and they go out in the very next moment and they disobey. Right from the point at which He brings them out of Egypt all the way into the promised land, and even into the future where the kings and the prophets come. Instead of obeying, instead of listening and obeying the commands and casting aside their false gods and worshiping God alone, they disobey. They choose the second best for their life. I want to look today at an Old Testament king by the name of Saul. Okay? There was a time in which the Israeli nation, around 1000 BC, didn't like the fact that they were the only nation that didn't have a king. And so they came to God through the prophet and said, we want a king like all the other nations. And God's first response was, you don't need a king. I'm your king. But God relented. And God gave them King Saul. And the scriptures in 1 Samuel said that Saul stood a foot above all the other Israelis. He was the perfect person to be king. And so Samuel anoints Saul king. And Saul has all this tremendous promise as a king. As a matter of fact, once he takes over the reign of king and he goes out and he battles the enemy, he has victory after victory after victory after victory. And everything seems grand and great. And then we read in 1 Samuel 9 and following that his life begins to unravel. He makes a number of fateful errors and miscalculations, and finally he deliberately disobeys God. And God rips the kingdom from him. And even though David spends 30 years, or Saul spends 30 years as king after that, his kingship is a colossal failure, in spite of all the victories that he won over God's enemies. The first one occurs in I think, 1 Samuel around chapter 11 or 12. And Samuel is busy doing something else, and he says, Saul, I want you to wait 7 days before you make the sacrifice in preparation for going in to battle the Philistines, who were the arch enemy of the nation. Just 7 days, Samuel says. Saul, wait until I get back, and together we'll prepare and make a sacrifice to God. And then that'll make us ready to enter into battle. Well, Saul got tired of waiting. He usurped and deliberately disobeyed Samuel. Impatiently, he offered to sacrifice himself, deliberately ignoring Samuel's instruction. And then when he gets there, he makes excuses. He says, oh, I really didn't want the sacrifice. I would have waited, Samuel, but the people, they kept bugging me, they kept bothering me, they kept pestering me. I had no choice but to give in and do the sacrifice. And Samuel tells God, or tells Samuel, God's going to take the kingdom and rip it from you. It could have been a great one, Saul. But Saul, you failed to be a man after God's own heart. Isn't it interesting that in spite of all of David's failures, who would be the next king, David gets spoken of by God as being a man after God's heart. He had the heart and compassion of the way God wanted him to reign, in spite of all of the failures that were a part of his life. We're only left kind of to wonder Saul's motive. Did he secretly despise Samuel and his authority as prophet over him? Was Saul so confident in his own military success, and he had great success, that he felt he didn't need to talk to God or get God's opinion? Was Saul just an insecure leader, not really knowing who he was, and just kind of one of those people that no matter what you told him or no matter what they did, they were just self-bent on destructing themselves? Did Saul not want God's authority over his life and just simply want to live life the way he wanted? But Samuel tells him, God's going to take your kingdom away from you. Well, the second major incident occurs a couple of years later, after Saul has these wonderful military victories. Now he's faced with the Amalekites, who were another archenemy of the Israelites in those days. After a great victory over a god, Saul goes up to Mount Carmel, which is in the valley in central Israel, and he erects a monument to himself. And Samuel finally gets along to where he was at Mount Carmel, and he brags. He says, Samuel, I defeated the Amalekites. God, surely please. Aren't you? And Samuel says to Saul, what's that sound I hear out in the field? And Saul says, oh, those are the goats bleeding. And Samuel asks Saul, why are there goats out there to begin with? Didn't God tell you that when you went and defeated the Amalekites, you were to kill everyone and all of their animals and not bring any spoils of victory back? And he disobeyed. And then he says, it wasn't my fault, Samuel. The people made me bring the sheep and the goats and the money back. Don't blame me, blame them. They're at fault. And then Samuel tells Saul, does God delight more in you offering a sacrifice or in you obeying his commands? Is it better to obey? Isn't it better to obey, Samuel says to Saul, than to sacrifice? Now stop and think about this for a minute. God loves it when you're here Sunday morning, doesn't he? Doesn't he? God loves it when you offer your gifts and your tithes. God loves it when we have these mission projects and we serve and give to those who are in need in our community and around our world. But does doing all of these things guarantee that we're living in a right relationship with God? Is it possible to do all of those things I just said, sacrifices in a way, but then our heart really isn't obedient? And while I place my bucket, okay, and my worship attendance and my giving and my serving and my little Christmas pot on the altar, then I go home and I do everything but act like Jesus the rest of the week. Because I'm not obeying. He tells me to forgive and I struggle with it. He tells me to be kind and patient, and well, that's another thing. It's not so easy. And so finally Saul tells Samuel, your disobedience means your kingdom's going to be given to another, and David becomes ultimately the new king. In desperation, Saul clutches at Samuel's robe, begging for forgiveness, begging to be given another chance. But he had resisted God's authority one too many times, proving he was untrustworthy for the call God had placed on his life. He failed to become the kind of king God wanted. Now the irony is He served as king for 30 more years. That's the irony of it. David didn't assume the kingship until 30 years after what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 14. And I didn't show you the scripture, but there's the story about him not being the king that God wanted him to be. But for the next 30 years, his kingship's a disaster. Oh, they have a victory here and there, but he spends most of his next 30 years chasing David, trying to kill him, because David's the threat to his kingship. And he does all he can do to get rid of David. And ultimately, it cost Saul his other children, who got killed in battle. And finally, at the end of the day, at the end of the reign, Saul falls on a sword and is killed. All of that potential to be the king God wanted him to be, but it never happened because he was disobedient. He didn't listen or heed or seek God's opinion. Maybe to put it in modern vernacular, he stiff-armed God. Like a runner going down the field would stiff-arm the opponent to get a few extra yards, to push him away. Now you might be saying, well, why are you telling me this story? I'm not like that. Well, yes we are, okay, at times. All of us struggle. All of us struggle to obey the commands of our Lord. There's not a single one of us here that I would say probably in this week, in every single moment of life of this week, reflected the character and attitude of Jesus Christ. And that's okay, because we fail. We all struggle in that area. Jesus reminds us in John chapter 14. Remember now, this is the man, the God-man Jesus, who lived his life in absolute, total obedience to God. Who at the end of his life, when he's about to be crucified, reminds the people, if you love me, if you truly love me, you will obey me. You will listen, you will heed, you will observe, you will walk according to the way I want. And if we're all honest about it, church, it is something that we do struggle with at times, and lots of times we're successful at it. You know, it's amazing how often, how easy it is sometimes to forgive a person, or to give, or to be patient, or be kind. And we also know that in the very next moment, it can become a struggle. If you love me, you will obey me. Not everyone, Jesus says, remember in Matthew 7, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of the Father. Jesus is our perfect example. In the garden, he cries out, Lord, not my will, but yours. In Philippians chapter 2, when Paul talks about Jesus, he says, have the mind and attitude of Jesus, who in obedience became a servant and died on the cross. Or in 1 Peter chapter 2, where Peter writes many, many years later, he says, remember the example of how Jesus suffered? He didn't argue with God. He didn't revile against the people. He didn't judge them. He simply went to the cross where his blood was shed. A life